He came home a hero, but the war never really ended for him. Major Charles Rain returns from years of captivity in a North Vietnamese prison to a life that feels unfamiliar and hollow. The banners, the parades, the handshakes, all of it feels like an empty celebration for a man who left pieces of himself behind enemy lines. And Rolling Thunder isn't just a tale of vengeance, it's an unsettling glimpse into what happens when a soldier's inner battle refuses to fade. Directed by John Flynn and written by Paul Schrader, with contributions from Haywood Gould, the 1977 film is a slow-burn descent into controlled rage and unresolved trauma. Unlike conventional revenge flicks, it doesn't glorify violence, it dissects it. Every shot, every line of dialogue, feels like a suppressed scream wrapped in silence. Audiences came expecting catharsis. What they got was a brutal, almost meditative portrayal of a man shattered by war and shaped by indifference. The film was too stark, too uncomfortable for its time. It faced edits, studio interference, and near censorship. Yet decades later, it has become a touchstone for filmmakers and cinephiles who recognize its unfiltered truth. Quentin Tarantino called it one of the greatest action films ever made, and even named his now iconic Rolling Thunder pictures in tribute. But even he couldn't fully restore the original vision, because parts of it were lost, altered, or buried. What remains is a cinematic time bomb, compact, quiet, and devastating when it goes off. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Rolling Thunder. Fact 1. The ending you were never meant to see. Before Rolling Thunder made it to theaters, it had already lost a key piece of its identity. In the original cut, the film concluded not with a triumphant exit, but with a hollow stillness. Major Rain alone in silence, emotionally vacant in the aftermath of his blood-soaked rampage. That bleak conclusion made some studio executives deeply uneasy. They felt it lacked closure, that it was too existential, and didn't offer the punchy payoff audiences expected from a revenge thriller. They ordered it changed. The ending was recut, truncated, and restructured to emphasize movement over meaning. According to screenwriter Haywood Gould, the scrapped ending was intentionally suffocating. It portrayed revenge as a dead end, not a victory. But 20th Century Fox wanted resolution, not reflection. Their version removed the emotional reckoning and made sure few even knew it had existed. To this day, that final scene remains unseen. It was never included in any home video release or restoration. And with the original print reportedly lost or locked away, we may never know exactly how Rolling Thunder was truly meant to end, but those who read the original script say it was less about justice and more about the echo left behind when all the noise fades. Fact 2. Tommy Lee Jones wrote his own line and made it iconic. One of the most haunting lines in Rolling Thunder wasn't written by the screenwriters. It came from Tommy Lee Jones himself, near the climax. When Major Rain asks Johnny if he's ready, Jones delivers a bone-dry reply. "I've been ready since I got back." That moment lands with chilling finality, a man so emotionally numb, revenge is all he has left. Originally, the script gave him a longer, more explanatory response. But Jones pushed back. He believed his character wouldn't say much, and certainly wouldn't rationalize. So he cut the dialogue down to a single sentence that felt stripped of emotion, yet loaded with implication. Director John Flynn agreed. The result? A moment of absolute stillness that stole the scene. Jones's delivery said more in one line than pages of exposition could. It helped shape his legacy as a master of restraint and gave the film one of its most memorable moments. Sometimes, silence isn't empty, it's tactical. Fact 3. Schrader disowned the film, but never escaped it. Paul Schrader has written some of the most psychologically intense films in cinema, but Rolling Thunder holds a complicated place in his legacy. He originally wrote it as a raw, unforgiving portrait of moral decay in post-Vietnam America, filled with symbolism, religious undertones, and slow-burning dread. But the film that was shot wasn't the one he envisioned. The studio brought in Haywood Gould to rewrite sections of the script, watering down Schrader's original ideas and pushing the story in a more conventional direction. The result? Schrader walked away. He publicly criticized the final version, saying it felt hollow and neutered. Only fragments of his vision remained, just enough to recognize his signature, but not enough to feel whole. And yet, despite disavowing it, Schrader would later admit that Rolling Thunder remained among his most personal works. The themes he wanted to explore, ritualized violence, isolation, self-destruction, would re-emerge in later films like Taxi Driver and First Reform. It may not have been the version he wanted, but Rolling Thunder planted the seeds of the stories that would come to define him. Sometimes, even ghosts of scripts leave scars. Fact 4. The hook was based on a real-life POW story. The visual centerpiece of Rolling Thunder, Major Rain's cold, metallic hook hand, is more than just a striking image. It was rooted in a haunting truth. Paul Schrader was inspired by an actual account of a Vietnam veteran who returned home after being held captive for years. The man had lost part of his arm and replaced it not with a functional prosthetic, but with a hook deliberately chosen as a symbol of what had been taken from him. He didn't hide his trauma. He wore it. Schrader latched onto that concept. In Rolling Thunder, the hook is more than a weapon. It's a ritual object, a symbol of what can't be restored. When Rain sharpens it on a whetstone in one of the film's most quietly unsettling scenes, the gesture isn't about vengeance alone. It's about transforming pain into purpose. The idea that trauma could be visible, tactile, and even weaponized gave the film an edge that resonated deeply with viewers, especially veterans. In a story filled with cold stares and buried emotion, the hook speaks the loudest. Fact 5. The final shootout echoed a real incident. The climactic gunfight inside the brothel didn't come purely from screenwriting imagination. It had roots in a real-life incident whispered among Texas law enforcement circles. Director John Flynn once hinted that he'd read about a pair of disgruntled veterans who stormed into a roadside bar suspected of harboring criminals and opened fire after the legal system failed them. It wasn't headline news, it was local legend, but it struck a nerve. Flynn and Schrader took the core of that idea, men trained to kill, returning to a country they no longer understood, and recontextualized it into Rolling Thunder's brutal finale. The parallels weren't perfect, but the emotion was identical, a sense that justice had become personal. That's why the shootout is so stark. There's no stylized choreography, no triumphant score, just a slow, calculated purge of violence. A ritual, not a climax. It doesn't feel like a movie. It feels like something that could have happened, and maybe it did. Fact 6. Censors wanted the garbage disposal scene gone. One sequence in Rolling Thunder nearly cost it theatrical release, the home invasion and torture of Major Rain. The most disturbing moment? When his hand is forced into a running garbage disposal. The scene is filmed with disturbing calmness. There's no fast cutting, no excessive gore, just the unflinching sound of metal grinding flesh, and a man refusing to scream. MPAA censors were alarmed. They considered the scene too realistic, not sensational, but psychologically invasive. They warned that without edits, the film would be rated X. For a major studio release, that was a death sentence. Flynn and the studio reached a compromise. They trimmed just enough frames to earn an R rating but kept the emotional core intact. To many viewers, it still feels unbearable. The moment doesn't just depict violence, it forces the audience into a kind of emotional complicity. You're not watching a hero fight back. You're watching a man be unmade. And that, the censors believed, was more dangerous than blood. Fact 7. Tarantino's obsession went beyond fandom. For most fans, discovering a forgotten classic is a matter of personal taste. For Quentin Tarantino, it became a mission. When he first watched Rolling Thunder, he didn't just appreciate its craft, he identified with its DNA. The film's slow burn tempo, sudden bursts of violence, and unspoken emotional weight deeply influenced his own style. Years later, when he launched his boutique distribution label under Miramax, he named it Rolling Thunder Pictures, a tribute that was both personal and strategic. Tarantino aimed to reintroduce cult films like Rolling Thunder to new audiences. He hoped to get the film remastered, re-released in theaters, and celebrated as the overlooked gem it was. But tangled rights and studio indifference hampered his efforts. Despite his clout, the original cut of the film remained largely inaccessible. Still, the film's imprint on Tarantino's work is unmistakable. The detachment of the bride, the code of retribution in Inglourious Basterds, even the stillness before carnage, all echo the thunder. This wasn't just admiration, it was artistic inheritance. Fact 8. Devane was a last-minute choice after big stars said no. William Devane is now inseparable from the cold, calculating role of Major Rain, but at first, he wasn't even in the running. Producers originally courted A-list names to anchor the project. James Caan, Steve McQueen, and Charles Bronson were all approached. Caan turned it down, calling it too detached. Bronson reportedly didn't want to play someone that emotionally withdrawn. McQueen, whose star power was at its peak, passed due to scheduling conflicts or, according to some, because the script made him uncomfortable. By the time Devane was cast, the studio had lowered expectations. He wasn't a major box office draw, but director John Flynn believed he had the quiet gravitas the role demanded. And Devane proved him right. His portrayal wasn't flashy, it was clinical, hollowed out, and terrifyingly internal. It gave the film a tension that no monologue could manufacture. Sometimes, the perfect choice is the one no one saw coming. Fact 9. The original trailer was so disturbing it was shelved. Long before the internet or red band trailers, Rolling Thunder managed to shake audiences with just a preview. But that preview didn't last long. The first official trailer featured shadowy imagery, disjointed audio clips, and flashes of torture and revenge, all underscored by a cold voice whispering, "He lost his hand." They'll lose everything. It was raw, grim, and unforgettable. Too unforgettable, in fact. Several theaters pulled the trailer from rotation after early viewers complained. Parents protested. Managers called it unsuitable for general audiences. It didn't just spoil the mood, it unsettled it. In response, 20th Century Fox withdrew the trailer and replaced it with a more generic version focused on action. The original cut quietly disappeared, surviving only in bootleg circles and private collections. Today, it's considered a lost artifact of movie marketing, a trailer that didn't sell the film but warned of it. And for many, that was far more effective. Fact 10. Rain was supposed to die in the original script. In the earliest drafts of Rolling Thunder, Major Charles Rain didn't survive his final act of vengeance. Paul Schrader had designed the narrative as a downward spiral, with the last bullet meant not for an enemy, but for Rain himself. The story was supposed to end with emotional and physical annihilation. Schrader viewed the brothel massacre not as justice fulfilled, but as a death ritual. Rain was never intended to return to civilian life. His journey was meant to close with silence, not survival. But studio executives had other ideas. They insisted Rain walk away from the carnage, alive and intact if not emotionally, then physically. They believed audiences needed resolution, a visible endpoint. A dead protagonist was too grim, too final. Schrader pushed back but ultimately lost. The rewrite changed the tone of the film's conclusion from fatalistic to ambiguous. Still, traces of Schrader's original intent remain: Rain's detached expression, his absence of relief, the way he exits, not victorious but empty. He may have lived, but he didn't return. Fact 11. Law enforcement feared the message behind the violence. Not long after its release, Rolling Thunder drew criticism from an unexpected source: police departments. In several U.S. cities, law enforcement officials voiced concern that the film romanticized vigilante justice. To them, it didn't just depict a failed legal system, it suggested that true justice could only be delivered at the end of a gun barrel. A police chief in Ohio was quoted saying, "It's dangerous when a film portrays the law as ineffective and encourages people to act alone." Some departments even discouraged off-duty officers from attending local screenings. The filmmakers, of course, denied that was the message. Schrader and Flynn maintained that the story was about trauma and disillusionment, not advocacy for violence. But the reaction revealed just how potent the film's emotional undercurrents were. When your story feels real enough to make law enforcement nervous, you've hit something deeper than entertainment. You've hit a nerve. Fact 12. A deleted church scene revealed Rain's despair. Not all of Rolling Thunder made it to the final cut, and one missing scene may have provided the clearest glimpse into Rain's fractured mind. In an early version of the film, there was a quiet moment where Rain enters a church and sits alone in the back pew during a baptism. He doesn't speak, doesn't react, he simply watches a baby being blessed in silence. William Devane reportedly improvised a single line under his breath, born with nothing to carry. It was never subtitled, barely audible. Test audiences found the scene too opaque. Studio heads found it too art house. It was removed during final edits, never restored in home releases. But for those few who saw it, the moment carried weight. It suggested that Rain's journey wasn't about revenge but resignation, that he had nothing left to believe in, not even redemption. Sometimes, what gets cut says more than what stays. Fact 13. The hook was real metal and it was dangerous. When it came to Major Rain's signature hook, the filmmakers didn't settle for rubber props or lightweight fakes. They went with something unsettlingly authentic. The final version of the prosthetic used in most scenes was made of actual metal, heavy, cold, and fully capable of inflicting harm if mishandled. William Devane insisted on the realistic prop to help ground his performance, claiming the weight altered his movement and helped him embody the character's trauma. It wasn't without risk. During one take, while rehearsing a confrontation, Devane accidentally grazed a fellow actor's shoulder with the hook. No serious injuries occurred, but the moment was enough for the crew to consider switching to a safer material. Devane refused. He believed the authenticity outweighed the danger literally. The prop team ultimately created two versions, one for action scenes and a heavier one for close-ups. But even the safe version was far from soft. In a film about weaponized pain, even the costume design had sharp edges. Fact 14. A crew member resigned over one controversial scene. Not everyone behind Rolling Thunder was comfortable with how far it went. Midway through production, an assistant director left the project over ethical concerns, specifically regarding the garbage disposal torture sequence. According to reports, he objected to the way the scene lingered, accusing the filmmakers of using realism not for emotional truth, but for spectacle. Director John Flynn disagreed. He maintained that the scene wasn't gratuitous, it was essential. Rain's maiming wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, the literal stripping away of agency. Flynn believed the audience needed to witness it unflinchingly to understand the character's silence and dissent. The departure caused a delay, forcing the team to reshuffle responsibilities on short notice. But the scene remained untouched. Years later, Flynn would say in an interview, "If we had softened that moment, the rest of the film would have collapsed." In Rolling Thunder, conviction ran through every frame, even when it divided the people making it. Fact 15. A PTSD class accidentally turned the film into a case study. In the early 80 seconds, a college psychology class intended to screen a documentary about post-traumatic stress disorder. When the film reel arrived damaged, the professor substituted Rolling Thunder, a film he'd seen but hadn't revisited in years. What followed was unexpected. The class, which included several Vietnam veterans, reacted with stunned silence. Some students left the room. One older attendee reportedly broke down during the scene where Rain stands in his empty home, motionless. The professor realized he had shown something far more visceral than a documentary. While fictional, Rolling Thunder had tapped directly into the behavioral patterns of isolation, hypervigilance, and emotional detachment that many veterans had described but rarely seen reflected on screen. From then on, the professor included the film in his syllabus, not as an entertainment piece, but as an unofficial study tool. He wrote, "It's not medically accurate, but emotionally, it's dead on. Sometimes, a story hits the truth harder than any textbook ever could." Fact 16. The brothel interior was borrowed from another genre. The climactic shootout in Rolling Thunder takes place in a dingy Texas brothel, a location that oozes grit and decay. But the building wasn't originally built for this film at all. The interior was a leftover set from a recently wrapped Western, complete with wood-paneled walls, swinging doors, and faux oil lamp. Instead of constructing something from scratch, the production crew repurposed the structure, giving it just enough cosmetic changes to fit the modern setting. They covered rustic elements with torn wallpaper and swapped out period props for sleazy, neon-lit details. But traces of its Western origins remained. In fact, if you pause during certain scenes, you can still spot remnants of its past life, like a faded wanted poster half concealed behind a curtain. Director John Flynn liked the symbolism. He saw it as poetic, a building built for gunfights in a fictional Old West, now recontextualized for a new kind of violence, quiet, personal, and post-war. The location didn't just save money, it told its own story. Fact 17. The composer had never worked on anything like this. Barry Dvorak, the man behind the sparse and unsettling score of Rolling Thunder, was an unconventional pick for a revenge thriller. His previous work leaned more toward pop compositions and television themes, not grim, meditative cinema, but that outsider status may have been exactly what the film needed. Director John Flynn didn't want a traditional score. He asked for music that would reflect emptiness rather than energy, something that captured the emotional frost of a man running on silence. Dvorak delivered. Low-frequency tones, dissonant keys, and lingering spaces between notes. The music doesn't swell or command emotion, it waits, it stalks. Critics didn't all love it at the time, but in hindsight, the score's restraint is a major reason the film lingers in the mind. It doesn't tell you what to feel. It makes you sit with the feeling you've already got. Sometimes the best soundtracks don't play loud, they haunt quietly. Fact 18. A real pal walked away from the production. Before cameras rolled, the producers hired a former prisoner of war as a technical consultant to help ground the film's portrayal of captivity and psychological damage. But his time on set was brief. Within the first week, he left the project voluntarily. According to reports from crew members, the consultant found the tone of the script too unsettling, not because it was inaccurate, but because it mirrored reality too closely. He allegedly warned the producers that the film walked a dangerous line, It could either provoke awareness or inspire emulation. What disturbed him most wasn't the violence, it was the emotional vacuum. He believed that viewers wouldn't recognize the film as a cautionary tale. They might see Rain not as a warning, but as a model. After his departure, no replacement was hired. In a strange way, his reaction proved the film's emotional authenticity. It wasn't about making viewers understand trauma, it was about forcing them to confront it. Fact 19. Military installations quietly refused to show the film. While never officially blacklisted, Rolling Thunder faced an unusual form of censorship not from the government, but from the military itself. During the late 1972 and early 1980s, it was common for American military bases to screen commercial films for active duty personnel. But Rolling Thunder was consistently absent from these listings. Not because of scheduling or logistics, but because it had been quietly discouraged. Reports from military entertainment coordinators revealed an unofficial stance. The film was deemed psychologically unsuitable for returning service members. The depiction of trauma, bureaucratic coldness, and brutal self-justice hit too close to home, especially for Vietnam veterans still struggling with reintegration. There was no memo, no policy. Just a silent decision across several bases to avoid showing the film. Even decades later, veterans who saw Rolling Thunder on VHS described it as emotionally triggering. The film wasn't propaganda, it was too raw for that. And maybe that's why it stayed off the projector reels at the very places it might have resonated most. When fiction reflects reality too accurately, even institutions look away. Fact 20. A sequel was planned, but it vanished without a trace. After Rolling Thunder gained cult status through late-night TV and home video, talk of a follow-up began circulating behind closed doors. The working title? Rolling Thunder. Aftermath. The proposed sequel would follow Johnny, played by Tommy Lee Jones, years after the events of the original. Haunted and in hiding, he'd be drawn back into violence when someone threatens the fragile peace of another veteran's family. The tone was reportedly darker, more introspective, a meditation on what happens when revenge doesn't bring relief. Early drafts were written, producers were on board, but Jones, then rising fast in Hollywood, passed on the project. Without him, momentum collapsed. William Devane declined as well, believing the original film needed no continuation. The script was shelved, the title was abandoned, no press release was ever issued. Over time, even film historians forgot it existed. All that remains are whispers and a single line from an archived interview. We had a sequel. It was too real and too late. Sometimes, the most haunting stories are the ones never told. Bonus fact: the film may have crossed into real life. In 1983, a strange and disturbing case emerged from California that made FBI analysts do a double take, and its link to Rolling Thunder was more than coincidental. A Vietnam War veteran was arrested after a string of violent assaults that bore eerie similarities to scenes from the film. He had lost part of his hand in combat and, according to police reports, fashioned his own crude prosthetic. When investigators searched his apartment, they discovered a well-worn VHS copy of Rolling Thunder and a journal filled with writings that directly quoted lines from the movie. Most chilling of all, the journal included entries referencing ritual preparation, justice through action, and a chilling adaptation of the film's tagline, "They took what mattered, now I take it back." At his trial, the defense argued that the man was suffering from untreated PTSD and had latched onto the film as a blueprint for his fractured worldview. Prosecutors rejected the claim as manipulative. The jury convicted him, but mental health professionals took notice. The case quietly entered FBI behavioral analysis discussions, not as proof of causation, but as a warning. Certain stories, when consumed through a lens of trauma, can become more than stories. No charges were brought against the filmmakers. No lawsuits followed. But for some, in the psychological field, the film became a cautionary example of how unresolved wounds can find dangerous validation in fiction. It wasn't the movie's fault, but it showed how fiction can sometimes speak louder to the broken than anyone intended. They labeled it just another revenge film. But Rolling Thunder was never about vengeance. It was about the quiet, invisible aftermath of war. A man rebuilt into something unrecognizable, not by choice, but by abandonment. Decades later, its wounds still feel fresh because they never really closed. Which truth disturbed you the most? And which forgotten film should we pull from the shadows next? Tell us in the comments. Some stories deserve to be exhumed.